At harvest time of the year, one evening in the night, these creatures came from a house they chose and took the youngest child of a household, and if no one interfered with the other members of the household, these creatures had nothing to do but take the child and watch them disappear into the woods, because once a father intervened, the other family members were torn apart and destroyed. Since then, no one has been able to do anything. These creatures appeared 150 years ago, and no one knows where they came from. This story is about Tom's and his 3 children. Tom and his 9-year-old daughter Alina, 11-year-old James and 14-year-old Jack and their father went to harvest the crops because it was harvest time. Their land was a little far from the village, so they returned a little early to return home before nightfall. Their father, who was doing his best to finish the harvest that day, thought that the work would take a little longer, so he sent the children ahead of time and planned to return home before sunset. But the father, who was dedicated to his work, realized that the sun was setting and immediately set off in panic. The 3 brothers did as their father told them and went back to the village and waited at home, not knowing what to do. And as the sun started to set, they started to get scared. Because they had never stayed home alone during harvest time, they always spent the night with their families. The sun had set and darkness began to fall. The children waited in their house in fear, and after a while the village became silent, and shadows and growls could be heard in front of the house. The children began to hug each other, terrified. Jack realized that the house the monsters had chosen was his, and tried to shield his brother, but in vain. The creatures entered the house to take the little girl. The children screamed in terror for help, but in vain. Jack and James, who were trying to protect their little brother, were horribly torn apart and killed by the monsters on the spot. As Tom came running home on the road, he kept running, praying to God that the house that had been chosen was not his. As he approached the village, he heard shuddering screams and cries. His legs began to give out, and he realized that the screams were coming from the direction of his own house. When he reached the house with the last of his strength, he was horrified by what he saw, because he saw the savage, mutilated bodies of his 2 sons. He fell to his knees and began to cry helplessly and guiltily. Tom remained on his knees, sobbing over the mutilated bodies for some time. But a thought flashed through his mind. Alina must still be alive. He knew he could not lose himself in guilt and despair. Wiping her tears, she stood up. When she stepped out of the house, she noticed the creature's tracks leading into the forest. The bushes were trampled, and there were strange claw marks in the dirt on the ground. For a moment, hesitation filled him. No one had ever followed them before, but as a father he could not hold back. He had to save the only child he had left. With no plan, only instinct, he plunged into the darkness of the forest. Each time he stepped into the forest, it grew darker, the branches of the trees covering him like a roof. Tom tried to see his way with only the moonlight seeping through, but the silence was different from what he expected. With every step, there was a rustle, a crunch, as if there were eyes watching him. Tom froze in his tracks as a faint shadow passed through the bushes for a moment. His heart beat like a drum in his chest. His breathing quickened. He whispered to himself, "It must be just an animal. Nothing more." But then there was a deep, inhuman growl. Tom took a step back, his palms sweaty. He was determined to follow the creature's tracks, but with each passing second, he felt more and more that he was in their playground. The darkness and the unknown were swallowing him. As Tom moved through the darkness, he suddenly heard a thin voice behind him. It sounded like a human voice, but there was something strange about it. The words came out slowly, hissing, "What are you doing here, stranger?" Tom quickly turned around. He recognized the figure standing a few feet away from him. The man was shabby from head to toe, wearing a torn cloak, his face covered in deep lines. His eyes glowed strangely in the dark. His hands were longer and thinner than they should have been. He looked unsettling but not hostile. At first, Tom didn't know what to say, but he answered in a low voice, "My daughter. The creatures have my daughter. I'm following them." The man tilted his head slightly to the side and looked at Tom, then gave a strange laugh. It sent a shiver down Tom's spine. "Following them? Ah, you have courage. But will that courage save you? You can't move until you know them." Tom frowned. "Who are you? What do you know about the creatures?" Instead of answering Tom's question directly, the man pointed to a dry branch on the ground. "You'd better sit down," he said, his voice mocking. "If you don't know, you should know. The creatures consume not only their victims, but also those who watch them." Tom hesitated, but felt obliged to, and slowly crouched down. The man took a step closer, noticing at that moment that his skin was a sickly pallor. The man stared at Tom and spoke. "The creatures. They are not of this world, nor are they a fairy tale. They came to this land 150 years ago. People don't know where they came from. But I do. They are beings born of their hunger. They feed on blood, fear, and despair. They come out at harvest time because that's when people are most vulnerable, and they always take the weakest." Tom's hands clenched into fists. "Then why did they take my daughter? What can I do to save her?" he asked. The man was silent for a moment, then spoke in a dark tone. "They only take what they want, that's the rule. If you don't interfere, you'll survive. But you chose to interfere, didn't you?" Tom rose from his seat in anger. "What? I wasn't supposed to do anything. I have to save her." The man gave Tom a pitying look. "Save your daughter. There will be a heavy price to pay for that, stranger. If you go any deeper into the forest, there will be no turning back. If you find them and confront them for your daughter, they won't just kill you. They'll take you back to their own world." Tom's mind was in turmoil. Were the creatures really dragging people to another world, or was this man playing with his mind? He questioned the man's trustworthiness, but he had no other choice. Tom couldn't process what the man had said for a moment. Another world? The price I have to pay? These words echoed in his head, but no matter how frightening they were, he couldn't give up. Alina could still be alive. "I won't leave her," he thought. The man watched Tom for a moment longer, then bent down and scooped up the dirt on the ground. "These tracks will lead you to their nest, but remember my warnings. Be very careful, and no matter what, don't provoke them," he said. Then he suddenly turned his back and disappeared into the depths of the forest. He had glided away like a shadow and disappeared. Tom stared in astonishment at the man's disappearance. For a moment he considered following him, but he knew it would be a waste of time. No matter how confused the man's words were, he had no choice but to continue following the tracks. His daughter's life depended on it. The atmosphere changed as Tom moved further into the forest. The sounds around him intensified. At one moment he heard a whisper in the leaves, and at another moment he felt a pair of eyes staring at him from the shadows of the trees. His heart began to race. His breathing became irregular. With each step he knew he was getting closer to the creature's nest. The tracks on the ground became more tangled at one point. The claw marks became more distinct. Broken branches and scattered feathers appeared around them. The forest was colder in this part of the forest, almost like a graveyard. Tom tried to encourage himself by saying, "I will find my daughter, no matter what." As Tom followed the tracks, the texture of the forest began to change. The trees grew thicker and took on strange shapes. The branches curled up like claws and reached toward the sky. Roots jutted out from the ground, forming a tangled web. The air was heavy. Even breathing was difficult. Tom felt himself being dragged deeper into darkness with each step. After a while, he reached a small clearing. The moonlight illuminated a huge cave in the middle of the clearing. The mouth of the cave resembled a face that did not belong to a human. In the darkness, it seemed as if a huge creature was about to emerge from it. Tom took an involuntary step back, but forced himself to think that his daughter was here. Surrounding the cave were strangely shaped stones. Some were embedded in the ground, some were leaning against each other. Strange symbols were carved into the stones. These symbols were neither an alphabet nor a language of pictures. When he looked at them with his eyes, they seemed to move. Tom's head began to spin, but he could not take his eyes off the symbols. A chilling humming sound could be heard coming from inside the cave entrance. The sound was neither animal nor human. It was like the deep breathing of an otherworldly being. The humming sound stabbed into Tom's heart like a knife, making his knees shake. But he thought of his daughter, and took a deep breath. He muttered to himself, "There's no going back from here." Taking a deep breath, Tom moved toward the cave entrance. With each step, the symbols on the stones seemed to glow. The cold air emanating from the cave cut through his skin like a sharp knife. When he entered, all the sounds of the outside world suddenly stopped. It was as if time had stopped here. The air inside the cave felt even heavier. The walls were covered in a black, sticky substance that looked almost like dripping blood. A dim light seeped through the cracks in the cave's ceiling, but the source of this light was far from natural. On the ground were piles of bones, large, small, human and animal. Tom tried not to look at the sight, but one was right at his feet, the skull of a small child. His heart clenched, but it did not stop. As he moved forward, a deeper hum began to come from inside the cave. This hum suddenly turned into other sounds. Tom heard a high-pitched laugh, followed by a muffled growl. He covered his ears, but the sounds continued as if they were seeping into his mind. Shadows were moving between the walls. These shadows did not look like people or animals. They were constantly changing shape. At that moment, he saw a light coming from the depths of the cave. It was a kind of reddish glow, and a silhouette emerged from where the light was. When Tom squinted, he realized he had reached the creature's lair. There was a huge void. In the middle of the cave, a stone pedestal rose from the ground, and on it huge, ugly creatures moved. Although their arms resembled human arms, their heads were pointed and their eyes were like fire. At that moment, a familiar voice reached Tom's ears. "Father!" It must have been Alina's voice. A short, frightened cry echoed, and then a deep silence. Tom turned in the direction of the sound. At the edge of the pedestal there was a small cage. Inside it he could make out a trembling figure. It was Alina. Seeing her still alive gave Tom hope, but it also deepened his fear. A creature leaned toward the cage. It scraped its long, thin claws against the bars and hissed terribly. Alina was trembling in the corner of the cage, her eyes closed. Tom took a step toward the creature, his fists clenched, but a growl from the ground stopped him in his tracks. The other creatures turned toward him, their eyes glinting in the darkness as they watched him. He knew he had to, but he also realized that confronting the creatures directly would be a fatal mistake. The man's warning echoed in his mind. "Do not provoke them." His eyes searched the walls of the cave. The symbols he saw were more complex than those on the stones outside, and some had begun to glow. Could these symbols have some meaning? He took a few steps closer to the wall and touched them. The surface beneath his fingers was cold and almost alive. Just then, something caught his attention among the symbols. One symbol was spinning slightly, and a thin red light was floating around it. A thought suddenly crossed Tom's mind as he watched the symbol. These creatures were somehow connected to these symbols. Perhaps he could use them as a distraction, but this would be a risky move. He quickly formed a plan in his mind. He would draw the creature's attention to the symbols and open a path for Alina. But before he could do that, he had to try something. He picked up a small stone lying on the ground and threw it at another symbol on the floor of the cave. When the stone hit the symbol, a flash of light suddenly erupted, and one of the creatures hissed in startle. When Tom saw that the symbol had caught their attention, he quickly looked for another stone. Soon he threw a few more stones at the symbols, and one by one, the creatures turned their attention to it. The creatures' shrill cries began to echo throughout the cave. Tom took this opportunity to run towards the pedestal and Alina's cage. When he reached the cage, his hands trembling, he felt for the iron bars. The lock was rusty and didn't look like it would open easily. "Alina, hang on," he whispered. Alina opened her eyes and saw Tom, and when she saw him, she begged in tears, "Father, save me." Tom took out his pocket knife and began to try to force the lock. However, the creatures quickly lost interest in the symbols and began to turn again. One of them took a giant step towards him from the pedestal and bent down to the ground with a wheezing sound. As Tom struggled to open the lock, he felt time running out. Tom continued to use his pocket knife to force the lock, his hands trembling. The rusty, hard texture of the metal almost broke the pocket knife. Behind him, the growling of the approaching creatures was getting louder. Alina, on the other hand, was looking at her father helplessly inside the cage. At that very moment, the lock clicked open. Tom quickly opened the cage door and pulled Alina into his arms. "Be quiet, okay?" he whispered. Alina nodded, but her tears would not stop. The creatures began to gather around the pedestal. When they noticed Tom and Alina, they let out a shrill scream. Just as they were about to attack, the symbols in the cave suddenly began to flash brighter. Tom noticed that the light emitted by the symbols was making the creatures pause for a moment. The light dazzled their eyes and slowed their movements. Tom quickly grabbed Alina by the arm and jumped down from the pedestal. "We have to run," he whispered. However, one of the creatures quickly moved to block their path. Tom bent down, picked up a piece of stone, and threw it at one of the glowing symbols. When the stone hit the symbol, the light shone even brighter and the creature shrieked and retreated. Noticing the effect of the symbols, Tom began to run towards the walls of the cave. "Alina, follow me," he said. The creatures were slowly gathering and preparing to attack again. Tom continued to throw stones, carefully examining the symbols around him to activate more. However, the cave began to shake from these movements. The ground was cracking. Small pieces of rock were falling from above. Suddenly, a deep noise echoed from the cave. The glow of the symbols turned into a halo of red light spreading into the cave. The creatures were startled and screamed once again by this light. Some were retreating, while others were lunging at them more wildly. Tom and Alina were trying to advance towards the entrance of the cave in this chaos. However, one of the creatures quickly blocked their way and reached out towards Alina. Tom jumped on the creature in anger. He swung at the creature's arm with his pocket knife, but the creature's skin was harder than stone. The creature threw Tom to the ground, but just as he was about to attack, another symbol began to glow, and the creature was startled again. This symbol was larger and more complex on the floor of the cave. Tom realized that this symbol provided a stronger defense against the creatures. He quickly picked Alina up from the ground and tried to stay in the light of the symbol. The creatures seemed unable to approach this symbol. Tom and Alina continued to advance towards the entrance of the cave. The symbols were fading rapidly, and the cave was beginning to tremble. The creatures were becoming more courageous as the lights of the symbols faded. Tom embraced Alina and ran out of the cave with all his might. A dazzling beam of light shone on a symbol at the entrance of the cave, and a deep explosion echoed behind it. The cave began to collapse, along with the creatures inside. He looked back as he quickly ran away. The shrill cries of the creatures echoed for a while under the collapsing cave, then completely stopped. He thought everything was over, but he still felt something was wrong. He lowered Alina's trembling body to the ground and hugged her tightly. "You're safe now," he said, but he could hardly believe his own words. Alina nodded through her tears, but she could not speak. At that moment, a shining stone caught his attention just near the cave's collapsing entrance. The stone had been thrown out of the cave and was decorated with intricate symbols. Tom picked up the stone. The moment he touched it, complex images began to appear in his mind. The images showed why the creatures had taken the children from the village, what the symbols meant, and how these creatures were actually part of a much larger plan. The children were like a kind of donation to the creatures, and the symbols were the keys to a deal that governed this donation. When the images ended, Tom sank to the ground, his head spinning. He dropped the stone in his hand and was out of breath. This stone held the secret of the creatures, and also the truths that the people of the village had kept silent about for years. When his eyes returned to the stone, he realized something. One of the symbols on the stone seemed to belong to a place he had seen in the village. A thought suddenly crossed his mind. Had these creatures really disappeared, or had they just bought time to reappear somewhere else? That sign in the village told him that this story was not over yet. As Tom examined the symbols on the stone, one of them stood out to him. The symbol was similar to the signs he had seen on the door of the old church in the village, which had been abandoned for years. His heart began to race. "This sign, it's the same one I saw in the church," he mumbled. The origin of the creatures and the village's role in this cursed cycle was much deeper and more complex than he had thought. For Alina's safety, he had to return to the village as soon as possible, but he had to go to that church and see what he could find. "If I really want to understand this curse, I need more information," he said, feeling a pang of guilt on his shoulders. When they arrived at the village, everything was quiet. Tom tried to persuade Alina to leave him home and rest, but Alina tearfully pleaded with her father, "Please don't leave me alone, Dad." Unable to ignore his daughter's fear, Tom decided to take her with him. Holding her hands tightly, they headed towards the old church. The church stood in the darkest corner of the village, far from the other buildings. This place, where no one had set foot for years, had an air that made the hairs on the back of the head stand on end, even with the rustle of the wind and the creak of the door. When they approached the door, they saw the same symbol on the stone in the middle of the door. "This can't be a coincidence," Tom said, his eyes fixated on the symbol on the door. Tom tried to understand how the stone could be connected to the door. When he brought the stone closer to the door, it began to warm up slightly and glow. Alina shrank back, but Tom knew he had to solve the stone's secret. "This stone could be a key," he said. Hesitantly, he pressed the stone onto the symbol. Suddenly a deep hum was heard, and the heavy doors of the church opened by themselves. A cold wind blew from inside, a thin whisper coming from the darkness. Alina held her father's hand tighter. Tom took a deep breath and stepped through the door. Everything in the church was covered in dust, but there were signs on the walls similar to the symbols in the cave. In the middle of the church stood an old altar. On the altar was a book. Its cover was decorated with rusted iron and filled with symbols. As Tom approached the book, the whispers became more distinct, as if inviting him to read something. "Father, this place hides something evil," Alina whispered fearfully. But Tom was sure that this book held clues to the origin of the creatures and the cursed history of the village. When he opened the book, he found an old text inside that told how the creatures came to the village 150 years ago and a deal they had made with the villagers. Tom quickly turned the pages of the book. Each line described how the creatures came to the village and how the villagers made a deal with them in desperation. 150 years ago, during a great famine, the villagers had sacrificed their children to survive and submitted to the creatures. But one note caught his attention. "When the pact is broken, the creatures will plunge not just the village, but the entire world into darkness." Tom's breath caught. If he ended this curse, there was a chance that the creatures would be released and create even greater danger. But if he continued, the village would continue to bear the burden of this curse every harvest. His hands trembled with indecision. He looked at Alina for a moment. Her innocent face seemed crushed under the weight of the curse. "This can't go on," he thought. His own family had lost their children, but on the last page of the book was a warning. Those who want to break the curse must offer their own blood. Tom's eyes widened. Did this mean sacrificing his own life? "Dad, don't do this," Alina said, noticing the determination on her father's face. Tom looked into his daughter's eyes and smiled. "Sometimes you have to pay the price to end a curse," he said. Tom picked up a rusty knife that was lying next to the book. When he looked at it, the symbols began to glow. The whispers had now become a murmur, completely taking over his mind. He raised the knife to his heart and looked at Alina one last time. "This is for you," he said. But at that moment another hand grabbed his wrist. When he turned, he saw the mysterious man in the forest. "Stop," the man said harshly. "Breaking the treaty will not destroy the creatures, it will only free them." Tom stepped back in surprise. The man continued, "In order for the creatures to be completely destroyed, you must find their source and destroy the traces of those who started this cycle." Tom did not know whether he could trust the man, but his words made sense. "And where is this source?" he asked. The man said darkly, "The symbol at the very beginning of the book will lead you to the right place. But be careful. It is something no one has ever done before." Tom put the knife down and looked at the symbol on the first page of the book. A map shape began to appear. It pointed to a place deep in the forest outside the village. "If I am to end this curse, I must find its source," he said. Tom decided he could not trust the man's words. This curse had claimed too many innocent lives, and he could not allow it to continue. "No matter what, I must end this cycle," he said determinedly. The man saw the determination in Tom's eyes and stepped back in disappointment. "It is your choice," he said, and disappeared into the darkness. Tom picked up the knife next to the book again. Alina looked at him with fearful eyes. "Father, please don't," she pleaded. But Tom knew there was no turning back now. He placed the book in front of him and looked at the symbols glowing on it. The whispers were louder now, turning into a murmur. He brought the knife to his chest. Just as he was about to sacrifice himself, the symbols on the book suddenly lit up brighter and rose into the air. The whispers echoing in Tom's mind ended with a scream. A deep tremor was felt from the creature's cave. A terrible roar from outside made the creature's presence felt. For a moment, Tom thought everything was over, but that moment turned into a nightmare. The creatures emerged with a force that spread throughout the village. Now, not just one child, but the entire village was under threat. "Father, something is wrong," Alina shouted, pulling her father's arm. Tom realized that he had set the creatures free, not destroyed them. Whispers were now rising from all over the village, and the creatures were emerging from the shadows one by one. While he was running away from the creatures, he began to search for a way to fix his mistake. There must be something else in the book, he thought. But the creatures were getting closer and closer to them. The lights in the other houses in the village began to go out, one by one. Screams were getting louder, and there were sounds of the creatures attacking the villagers. Tom ran back inside the old church to protect Alina. He could feel the creatures trying to get through the door. At that moment, a faint text on the last page of the book caught his attention. "Blood alone is not enough to end this curse. The source of the creatures must be sealed." Tom realized that the symbols in the book were on the stone in the cave. Tom held on tightly to the church door. The screams and claws of the creatures continued to strain against the wooden door. Alina clung to her father in fear. "Father, what do we do?" she asked. Tom took a deep breath and answered with determination. "We need to get back to the cave to end this curse. This will never end until we seal the source." They found a secret exit behind the church and escaped the creatures. The village was silent and dark. Every shadow, every crackle, seemed like a sign of the creature's presence. Tom, holding Alina's hand tightly, set off toward the cave. As they approached the cave, a thick fog had settled around them. Something made Tom's insides tingle. It was as if the cave was waiting for them. As they entered, the symbols on the quarry began to glow with a red light. The creatures' breaths could be felt. "Dad, this place is scary," Alina said, her voice trembling. Tom tried to comfort her. "Trust me. We'll finish this." He opened the book in his hand and matched the symbols to the stone. He realized that some kind of ritual had to be completed, but he had to do it quickly, without drawing the creature's attention. At that moment, a hum was heard from deep within the cave. The creatures were moving toward them from inside the cave. Tom began to combine the symbols, quickly reading the book's instructions. As each symbol was placed in the right place, the lights on the stone's surface grew brighter. But the creatures were very close now. Tom turned to Alina and said, "Stay here and hide no matter what." Alina nodded through her tears. As Tom placed the last symbol in place, one of the creatures lunged at him. Tom managed to complete the symbol, although he briefly grazed the creature's claws. The stone was suddenly illuminated by a burst of energy. The creatures shrieked and fell back. A kind of energy storm had formed inside the cave. Unable to withstand the light, the creatures began to vanish one by one, but the energy was also drawing Tom into it. "Father!" Alina screamed and tried to run to him, but Tom held up a hand to stop her. "This has to end, Alina," he said. "I love you. Be safe." The lights in the cave began to fade as the energy engulfed Tom completely. The cave fell silent. Alina looked tearfully at the place where her father had disappeared. The creatures were gone. The curse was over, but the price of this victory had come too. Alina picked up her father's book and walked out of the cave. When she returned to the village, she saw that everything that had been under the curse had begun to return to normal. But behind this ordinariness there were traces of her father's sacrifice. Alina hid the book to keep her father's legacy alive. She would never allow the curse to return. If you like mystery and horror stories, don't forget to subscribe and like.